The clock on the wall showed 8:47 p.m. when 16-year-old David finally finished mopping the last aisle at Peterson's grocery store. His back ached from lifting heavy boxes all evening, and his sneakers squeaked against the wet floor as he made his way to the employee break room. The store manager, Mr. Peterson, was counting the day's cash register while humming an old song that David couldn't recognize. "Good work today, son," Mr. Peterson called out without looking up from his counting. "Same time tomorrow?" David nodded, even though he knew the old man wasn't really paying attention. "Yes, sir, 4:30 sharp." He grabbed his worn backpack from the metal locker and slung it over his shoulder. The weight of his school books reminded him that he still had math homework waiting at home, but his tired brain could barely think about numbers right now. The cool October air hit his face as he stepped outside. Main Street was mostly empty except for a few cars passing by and the distant sound of music coming from Tony's diner 3 blocks down. David pulled his thin jacket tighter around his chest and started the familiar walk home to Maple Avenue. The streetlights cast long shadows on the sidewalk, and he found himself counting his steps like he always did when he was tired. His mom would probably be asleep by now. She worked the evening shift at Riverside Hospital, taking care of patients and dealing with paperwork that never seemed to end. David tried to be quiet when he got home, because she needed every minute of rest she could get before her next shift. Started at 6 in the morning. Sometimes he left her little notes on the kitchen table, just to let her know he'd made it home safely. As David walked past the old brick church on 5th Street, he thought about the $23 he'd earned today. It wasn't much, but every bit helped. His mom never complained about money, but he saw how she looked at the bills stacked on their small kitchen table. He saw how she bought the generic cereal instead of the name brand, and how she wore the same 3 work uniforms over and over, because new ones were expensive. The neighborhood started to change as he continued walking. The small houses with chain-link fences gave way to bigger homes with perfectly trimmed lawns and fancy cars in the driveways. This was the Riverside District, where doctors and lawyers and business owners lived. David usually took the long way around this area, but tonight he was too tired to add extra blocks to his journey home. He was walking past a large white house with tall columns when he heard it. A woman's voice, high and panicked, calling for help. David stopped walking and listened carefully. There it was again, coming from somewhere ahead of him near the corner where Oak Street met Riverside Drive. His first thought was to keep walking. This wasn't his neighborhood, and these weren't his people. Rich folks had their own problems, and they usually had their own ways of solving them. But something about the desperation in that voice made his feet stop moving. He stood there for a moment, listening to his own heartbeat and the distant sound of someone in trouble. David found her lying next to a shiny black car that probably cost more than his mom made in 2 years. She was a woman in her 50s, with silver hair styled perfectly even though she was lying on the cold concrete. Her expensive-looking dress was torn at the shoulder, and her matching purse had spilled its contents across the sidewalk. Lipstick, car keys, credit cards, and pills were scattered everywhere. "Help me," she whispered when she saw David approaching. Her face was pale and sweaty, and she was pressing both hands against her chest like she was trying to hold something inside. I can't breathe right." David dropped his backpack and knelt beside her. He'd seen this before when his grandfather had his heart attack 3 years ago. The same look of fear, the same way of clutching at the chest, the same struggle to get enough air. His health teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, had made them practice CPR on those plastic dummies until everyone in class could do it with their eyes closed. "Ma'am, I'm going to help you," David said, trying to keep his voice calm even though his hands were shaking. "I think you're having a heart attack. I need to call for help." He pulled out his old phone and dialed 911 with fingers that felt clumsy and thick. The emergency operator answered on the second ring, and David tried to explain where he was and what was happening. The woman on the ground was breathing in short, quick gasps, and her eyes kept closing like she was fighting to stay awake. "The ambulance is coming," the operator told him. "Can you check if she's breathing normally?" David looked down at the woman. Her breathing was definitely not normal. It was shallow and irregular, and her lips were starting to look blue around the edges. He remembered Mrs. Rodriguez saying that when someone's not getting enough oxygen, their lips change color. Ma'am, what's your name? David asked, partly because he wanted to keep her talking and partly because he felt weird helping someone whose name he didn't know. Victoria, she managed to say between breaths. Victoria Ashford. The name didn't mean anything to David, but he nodded like it did. Okay, Mrs. Ashford. The paramedics are on their way. I'm going to stay right here with you until they arrive. Her hand found his arm and gripped it tightly. Her skin felt cold and damp, and David could feel her pulse racing under his fingers. He'd never been responsible for another person's life before, and the weight of it was almost overwhelming. What if he did something wrong? What if she died while he was sitting here not knowing how to help? But then he remembered something else. Mrs. Rodriguez had taught them. Sometimes the most important thing you can do is just be there. Sometimes just having another person with you when you're scared makes all the difference in the world. My husband, Victoria whispered. He doesn't know where I am. What's his phone number? David asked. I can call him for you. She tried to tell him, but the numbers came out jumbled and confused. David realized she was probably going into shock, which was another thing he'd learned about in health class. He took off his thin jacket and laid it over her shoulders, even though the October night was making him shiver. The sound of sirens in the distance was the most beautiful thing David had ever heard. Red and blue lights began flashing against the houses on Oak Street, and within minutes, 2 paramedics were running toward them with a large medical bag and what looked like a portable stretcher. Good job, kid, one of the paramedics said as he knelt down beside Victoria. How long has she been like this? Maybe 10 minutes, David replied, stepping back to give them room to work. She said she couldn't breathe, and she's been holding her chest the whole time. The paramedics moved with quick, practiced efficiency. They attached wires to Victoria's chest, put an oxygen mask over her face, and started an IV in her arm. David watched from a few feet away, feeling both relieved that professional help had arrived and strangely reluctant to leave. As they were loading Victoria onto the stretcher, she turned her head toward David and pulled the oxygen mask away from her mouth for just a moment. Thank you, she said, her voice stronger now than it had been before. She reached into the pocket of her dress and pulled out a small white business card, pressing it into David's hand. David looked down at the card as the ambulance drove away, its sirens fading into the night. In elegant gold letters, it read, Victoria Ashford, Ashford Industries. Below that was a phone number and an address in the most expensive part of town. He gathered up the items that had fallen from her purse and handed them to the second paramedic, who promised to make sure Victoria got them at the hospital. Then David picked up his backpack, put his jacket back on, and continued his walk home, not knowing that he had just saved the life of one of the most powerful women in the city. The business card felt heavy in his pocket as he walked the last 6 blocks to Maple Avenue, where his mom's car sat in their small driveway and a single light glowed in their kitchen window. David's alarm clock buzzed at 6:15 a.m., just like it did every morning. He rolled over and hit the snooze button, his body still heavy with sleep. The events from last night felt like a strange dream. The woman on the sidewalk, the ambulance, the business card that was now sitting on his nightstand. In the gray morning light filtering through his small bedroom window, it all seemed unreal. He could hear his mom moving around in the kitchen, getting ready for her morning shift at the hospital. The coffee maker was gurgling, and he could smell toast burning slightly, which meant she was running late again. David stretched and forced himself out of bed, his muscles still sore from yesterday's work at the grocery store. Morning, honey, his mom called from the kitchen when she heard his footsteps in the hallway. I made you some toast, but I've got to run. Mrs. Patterson in room 204 needs her medication adjusted, and Dr. Williams wants to see me before rounds start. David found his mom rushing around the small kitchen, grabbing her purse and the thermos of coffee she carried everywhere. Linda Thompson was 42 years old, but looked older, with tired eyes and hands that were always rough from washing them so many times during her hospital shifts. She worked harder than anyone David knew, and she never complained about it. Mom, you forgot your lunch again, David said, pointing to the brown bag sitting on the counter. Oh, thank you, baby. She grabbed the bag and kissed his forehead quickly. There's $20 on the table for groceries. We need milk and bread and see if they have any of that cheap pasta sauce on sale. I'll be home around 7 tonight. The door closed behind her, and David was alone with the quiet hum of their old refrigerator and the distant sound of morning traffic. He ate his toast while looking out the kitchen window at their neighbor, Mr. Garcia, who was already working in his small garden even though it was barely past sunrise. The business card from last night was still in his jacket pocket. David pulled it out and studied it again. Victoria Ashford, Ashford Industries. He'd never heard of the company, but the card felt expensive, with thick paper and gold lettering that caught the light. He wondered if the woman, Victoria, was okay, if she'd made it through the night at the hospital. School started at 8:15, which meant David had to catch the 7:45 bus on Maple Avenue. He threw his books into his backpack, grabbed the $20 bill his mom had left, and headed out into the cool morning air. The walk to the bus stop took him past the same houses he'd seen 1,000 times, small homes with front porches, where people left their shoes and bicycles, chain-link fences that needed fixing, and yards where kids' toys sat forgotten in the grass. The school bus was already crowded when David climbed on. He found a seat near the back next to Carlos, a quiet kid from his chemistry class who always did his homework on the bus ride to school. Carlos was working on math problems, his pencil moving quickly across the page while he tried to finish. Before first period started. "You look tired, man," Carlos said without looking up from his notebook. "You work late again last night?" David nodded, watching the familiar neighborhoods pass by outside the window. "Yeah, until almost 9. Then, I had to walk home through the rich part of town." "Why'd you go that way? That's like 2 miles out of your way." David almost told Carlos about what happened, about finding Victoria Ashford on the sidewalk and riding in the ambulance. But something stopped him. Maybe it was because it felt too personal, or maybe because he wasn't sure anyone would believe him. Instead, he just shrugged and said he'd been too tired to think about taking the long way around. Jefferson High School looked the same as always when the bus pulled up. Red brick walls, windows that needed cleaning, and a flagpole where the American flag snapped in the morning breeze. Students were walking up the front steps in groups, talking and laughing about things that had happened over the weekend. David felt separate from all of it, like he was watching a movie of other people's lives. His first class was American history, with Mr. Thompson, who had the unfortunate habit of calling on students who looked like they weren't paying attention. David tried to focus on the lesson about the Great Depression, but his mind kept wandering back to Victoria Ashford and the way she'd gripped his arm when she was scared. "Mr. Rodriguez," Mr. Thompson said suddenly, making David jump. "Can you tell us what happened to unemployment rates during the 1930s? David scrambled to remember what they'd been talking about. They went up? A lot of people lost their jobs?" Mr. Thompson looked unimpressed but moved on to another student. David made a mental note to pay better attention in his next class. Lunchtime was always the same routine. David bought a slice of pizza and a carton of milk with the $3. He allowed himself to spend each day, then sat at the table near the windows where he usually ate with Carlos and a few other quiet kids from his classes. Today, though, Carlos was excited about something. "Did you guys hear about what happened in the Riverside district last night?" Carlos asked, unwrapping a sandwich his grandmother had made for him. "My dad works security at the hospital, and he said they brought in some rich lady who almost died of a heart attack. She was lying on the street for who knows how long before someone found her." David's pizza suddenly tasted like cardboard in his mouth. "Really?" he managed to say. "Yeah, and get this. Whoever found her was just some kid walking by. Can you imagine? Just some random person who happened to be in the right place at the right time. My dad said if they hadn't been there, she probably would have died right there on the sidewalk." Another kid at the table, Tony, shook his head. "Man, that's crazy. I wouldn't even know what to do if I found someone having a heart attack. I'd probably just panic and call 911. "That's exactly what you should do," Carlos said. "But this kid apparently knew CPR or something. My dad heard the paramedics talking about it when they brought her in. Said whoever it was really knew what they were doing." David took a sip of his milk and tried to look casual. "Is she okay? The lady, I mean." "Yeah, she's fine now. Turns out she's married to some big-shot businessman, Robert Ashford or something like that. Owns half the businesses downtown from what my dad says. They're probably going to want to find Whoever helped her and give them some kind of reward or something. The mention of a reward made David's stomach twist. He didn't want a reward. He'd just done what anyone would do, what anyone should do when they see someone in trouble. The idea of rich people tracking him down to give him money made him uncomfortable. In a way he couldn't quite explain. The rest of the school day passed in a blur. David sat through English class, where they were reading a book about a kid who goes on adventures he never asked for. He survived chemistry class, where Mrs. Rodriguez handed back last week's test with a B+ written in red ink at the top. He even managed to stay awake during his last period study hall, where he was supposed to be working on homework, but instead found himself staring out the window at the parking lot. At 3:20, the final bell rang and students began pouring out of classrooms and into the hallways. David gathered his books and headed for his locker, planning to grab his work clothes and head straight to Peterson's grocery store for another afternoon of stocking shelves and mopping floors. But as he was spinning the combination on his locker, he heard his name over the school's intercom system. David Rodriguez, please report to the principal's office immediately. David Rodriguez to the principal's office. The hallway around him seemed to go quiet, and David felt dozens of eyes turning in his direction. Getting called to the principal's office was never good news, especially when it happened over the intercom where everyone could hear it. His mind raced through the past few days, trying to think of anything he might have done wrong. His grades were decent, he'd never been in a fight, and he always showed up to class on time. Carlos appeared at his side, looking concerned. Dude, what did you do? I have no idea, David said honestly, closing his locker with shaking hands. The business card in his jacket pocket suddenly felt like it weighed 100 pounds. David's legs felt like rubber as he walked down the long hallway toward Principal Martinez's office. Every step echoed in the nearly empty corridor, and he could feel his heart beating so hard he wondered if other people could hear it. Students, who were still at their lockers, turned to watch him pass, and he heard someone whisper, "Wonder what Rodriguez did to get called down." The main office was busy with the usual after-school activity. Secretary Mrs. Chen was answering phones while sorting through a stack of papers, and two younger students sat in the waiting chairs, probably there for detention or to call their parents about forgotten homework. But David barely noticed any of it because his attention was completely focused on what he could see through the glass window of the principal's office. There was a man in there, a tall man wearing a suit that probably cost more than David's mom, made in a month. He was standing with his back to the window, talking to Principal Martinez, and even from behind, David could tell this wasn't someone who belonged in a public high school. Everything about him screamed money and power, from his perfectly styled gray hair to his shiny leather shoes. "David Rodriguez?" Mrs. Chen called out, looking up from her phone. "Principal Martinez is waiting for you. Go right in." David's mouth went dry. He wiped his sweaty palms on his jeans and knocked on the office door, even though he could see through the glass that they were already looking at him. "Come in, David," Principal Martinez said, and her voice sounded different somehow. Usually she was all business, talking fast and getting straight to the point. Today she sounded almost nervous. "Please, have a seat." The man in the expensive suit turned around, and David found himself looking into the most intense pair of gray eyes he'd ever seen. The man was probably in his late 50s, with silver hair and lines around his eyes that suggested he smiled often, but right now his expression was completely serious. He looked like someone who was used to being the most important person in any room he entered. "David," Principal Martinez continued, "this is Mr. Robert Ashford. He's here because he'd like to speak with you about something that happened last night." The name hit David like a punch to the stomach. Ashford, Victoria Ashford. This was her husband, the businessman Carlos had mentioned at lunch. David's hand instinctively went to his jacket pocket where the business card was still hiding, and he wondered if somehow this man knew he had it. Robert Ashford stepped forward, and David noticed that despite his expensive clothes and powerful presence, his eyes looked tired. More than tired. They looked like the eyes of someone who had spent the night worrying about something that mattered more than money or business deals. "Hello, David," Mr. Ashford said, and his voice was deeper than David had expected. "I think you know why I'm here?" David's throat felt like sandpaper. I'm not sure, sir." Mr. Ashford studied him for a long moment, and David had the uncomfortable feeling that this man could see right through him. Last night, around 9 o'clock, someone found my wife Victoria collapsed on Oak Street. She was having a heart attack. And whoever found her called 911 and stayed with her until the paramedics arrived. The doctors at the hospital told me that if this person hadn't acted so quickly, my wife would have died. Principal Martinez was watching this conversation like she was watching a tennis match, her head turning back and forth between David and Mr. Ashford. David could see the confusion on her face. She obviously had no idea why this important businessman was in her office talking to one of her students. The paramedics told me a few things about the person who helped Victoria, Mr. Ashford continued. They said it was a young man, probably a teenager. They said he knew CPR and kept my wife calm until help arrived. They also said he made sure all of her personal belongings were collected and given to the hospital staff. David's hands were shaking now, and he shoved them under his legs to hide it. That's good, sir. I'm glad your wife is okay. Are you? Mr. Ashford asked, and there was something in his tone that made David look up and meet those gray eyes again. Because I've spent the last 18 hours trying to find the person who saved my wife's life. I've talked to everyone who lives on Oak Street. I've reviewed security camera footage from the businesses nearby. I've even had my assistant call the 911 dispatch center to see if they had any additional information about the caller. David felt like the room was getting smaller. The walls seemed to be moving closer, and the air felt thick and hard to breathe. He wondered if this was what Victoria had felt like last night when she was having her heart attack. And do you know what I found? Mr. Ashford asked, but he didn't wait for an answer. I found that the person who called 911 gave the dispatchers a very specific location. He said he was at the corner of Oak Street and Riverside Drive, right in front of the White House with the tall columns. He knew the exact address. He also knew that my wife was having a heart attack, not just some general medical emergency. Principal Martinez was leaning forward in her chair now, clearly fascinated by this mystery. That's quite impressive for a teenager to know those things, she said. Yes, it is, Mr. Ashford agreed, never taking his eyes off David. But here's the interesting part. When I reviewed the security footage from the bank across the street, I could see someone kneeling next to my wife, a young man with dark hair, wearing a thin jacket and carrying a backpack. The image isn't clear enough to see his face, but I could see him gathering up my wife's belongings and handing them to the paramedics. David's heart was pounding so hard now that he was sure everyone in the room could hear it. His palms were sweating, and he kept swallowing because his mouth felt like it was full of cotton. Now, the reason I'm here, Mr. Ashford said, pulling a chair closer to David and sitting down so they were at eye level, is because I believe that young man was you. The words hung in the air like smoke. Principal Martinez gasped softly, and David felt like the floor was falling out from under him. Part of him wanted to deny it, to say there must be some mistake, but the way Mr. Ashford was looking at him made lying impossible. David started, then stopped. His voice came out as barely a whisper. I was just walking home from work. And you saw my wife in trouble. She was scared, David said, the words coming out in a rush now. She couldn't breathe right, and she was alone, and I couldn't just walk away. Mr. Ashford leaned back in his chair, and for the first time since David had entered the office, the man's expression softened. No, you couldn't. Could you? Even though you were in a neighborhood where you probably don't belong, even though you were tired from working all day, even though helping a stranger could have gotten you into trouble or made you late getting home. I just did what anyone would do, David said quietly. No, Mr. Ashford said firmly. You did what you would do, and that's exactly why I'm here. Principal Martinez finally found her voice. David, is this true? You saved Mrs. Ashford's life. David nodded, feeling like he might throw up. I learned CPR in health class. Mrs. Rodriguez made us practice until we could do it right. I didn't really think about it. I just saw someone who needed help. Mr. Ashford stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the school parking lot, where students were climbing into cars and buses, heading home to their normal lives. When he turned back around, his expression was different again, more determined, like he'd just made an important decision. David, he said, I didn't come here to embarrass you or get you in trouble. I came here because I wanted to meet the person who saved my wife's life. I wanted to look you in the eye and say thank you." But even as he said it, David could tell there was more. The way Mr. Ashford was standing, the way he kept glancing at Principal Martinez, the way his hand kept moving toward the briefcase that was sitting on the floor beside his chair, it all suggested that saying thank you was just the beginning. Mr. Ashford walked back to his chair and picked up the briefcase that had been sitting on the floor. It was made of expensive leather, the kind that David had only seen in movies about wealthy businessmen. As Mr. Ashford placed it on Principal Martinez's desk, David noticed that his hands weren't quite steady. For someone who looked so confident and powerful, he seemed nervous about whatever was inside that briefcase. "David," Mr. Ashford said, clicking open the brass latches, "I need you to understand something. I'm not here to give you a reward." David felt confused. "Sir?" I'm not here to write you a check and send you on your way," Mr. Ashford explained, pulling out a thick folder. "Money can't pay back what you did for my family. And honestly, I don't think that's what you need most anyway." Principal Martinez leaned forward, clearly curious about what was happening. "Mr. Ashford, I'm not sure I understand what you're getting at." Mr. Ashford opened the folder and spread several documents across the desk. David could see college brochures, official-looking papers with lots of small print, and what appeared to be photographs of buildings he didn't recognize. His heart started racing again, but this time it wasn't from fear. It was from excitement mixed with confusion. "David, tell me about your plans after high school," Mr. Ashford said, sitting back down and looking directly at him. I want to go to college," David answered honestly. "I'd like to study medicine, maybe become a doctor. But college is expensive, and my mom works really hard already. I don't want to put more financial pressure on her." "What about scholarships?" Principal Martinez asked. "David, your grades are good. You could probably qualify for some financial aid." David shrugged. "Maybe some, but not enough. And even with scholarships, there's still living expenses, books, all the other costs. I've been saving money from my job at the grocery store, but it's not much." Mr. Ashford nodded like he'd expected this answer. "What if I told you that money didn't have to be the thing that stops you from becoming a doctor?" "I'd say that sounds too good to be true," David replied, and immediately worried that he'd been too honest. But Mr. Ashford smiled for the first time since David had entered the office. "Smart answer," he said. "You're right to be suspicious, but let me explain what I'm thinking." He pulled out one of the college brochures and handed it to David. "Have you ever heard of Thompson University?" David looked at the glossy brochure. Thompson University was one of the best schools in the state, with a medical program that was famous nationwide. "I've heard of it, but I never thought, this is way out of my league, sir." "Why?" Mr. Ashford asked simply. "Because kids like me don't go to schools like this," David said, feeling embarrassed about having to explain something so obvious. "Kids like you?" Mr. Ashford repeated. "You mean kids who work after school to help their families? Kids who know CPR and use it to save lives? Kids who stay calm in emergencies and make sure strangers get the help they need?" Principal Martinez was nodding along. "David, Mr. Ashford has a point. You showed incredible maturity and skill last night." Mr. Ashford pulled out another document. "For the past 5 years, my wife and I have been talking about starting a scholarship program. Not just throwing money at students with good test scores, but really investing in young people who have the character to make a difference in the world." David's hands were shaking as he looked at the papers spread across the desk. "I don't understand. Are you offering me a scholarship?" "I'm offering you something bigger than that," Mr. Ashford said. "I want to create a partnership. You would be the first recipient of the Ashford Foundation Youth Leadership Program. We would pay for your entire college education, tuition, room and board, books, everything. But in return, you would help us build this program." "Help you how?" David asked, still not quite believing what he was hearing. "During summer breaks and school holidays, you would work with our foundation team. You'd help us identify other young people who deserve the same opportunity you're getting. You'd visit schools, talk to students, share your story. You'd help us figure out how to find kids who have potential but might not have the best grades or the highest test scores. Principal Martinez was staring at the documents on her desk like she couldn't believe what she was seeing. Mr. Ashford? This is incredible. David, do you understand what he's offering you? David felt like his brain was moving through thick fog. You want me to go to Thompson University? I want you to go wherever you think you can get the best education, Mr. Ashford said. Thompson is just one option. We can look at other schools too. The important thing is that you get the training you need to become the doctor you want to be. But why me? David asked. You don't even know me. Yesterday I was just some kid who works at a grocery store. Mr. Ashford leaned back in his chair and was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice was softer, more personal. David, can I tell you something about myself? David nodded. When I was your age, I was a lot like you. My family didn't have much money. My dad worked construction, and my mom cleaned houses. I had good grades, but college seemed impossible. I figured I'd graduate high school, find a job, and that would be my life. He paused and looked out the window again. But when I was 17, something happened that changed everything. I was walking home from my after-school job at a hardware store when I saw a car accident. A businessman in an expensive suit was trapped in his car, and it was starting to catch fire. Everyone else was just standing around waiting for the fire department, but I ran over and helped pull him out. David felt goosebumps on his arms. What happened? He turned out to be the owner of several businesses in town. A week later, he showed up at my high school, just like I showed up at yours today. He told me he wanted to pay for my college education, but not as charity. He said he was looking for someone with character, someone who would run toward trouble instead of away from it. Did you take his offer? Principal Martinez asked. I did, and it changed my entire life. I went to college, studied business, and eventually started my own company. But more importantly, I learned that success isn't just about what you achieve. For yourself, it's about what you do for other people. Mr. Ashford pulled out a pen and placed it on top of the documents. That businessman who helped me died 10 years ago. I promised him that someday I would do the same thing for someone else. I've been waiting for the right person, someone who reminded me of myself at 17, someone who would help a stranger without thinking about what they might get in return. David stared at the pen, then at the college brochures, then at Mr. Ashford's face. This is really happening? Only if you want it to happen, Mr. Ashford said. I'm not going to pressure you into anything. This is a big decision, and you should. Talk to your mother about it. But David, I want you to know that I believe in you. Not because of your grades or your test scores, but because of who you are as a person. The room was completely quiet except for the sound of students laughing in the hallway outside. David looked at Principal Martinez, who was smiling with tears in her eyes. He looked at the documents that could change his entire future, and he looked at Mr. Ashford, this powerful man who was offering him a chance he'd never dreamed possible. What would I have to do first? David asked quietly. Mr. Ashford smiled. First, you finish high school, then you choose a college, and then you help me find the next kid who deserves the same opportunity. 3 months had passed since that life-changing afternoon in Principal Martinez's office, and David still sometimes woke up wondering if it had all been an incredible dream. But then he would see the acceptance letter from Thompson University, pinned to his bedroom wall, or the stack of books about college preparation that Mr. Ashford had given him, and he knew it was all real. Today was different from all the other days since then. Today, David was standing backstage at Jefferson High School, wearing his first real suit and tie, getting ready to speak to an auditorium full of people about something that still felt too big to be his own story. His palms were sweaty, and he kept checking his pocket to make sure his speech notes were still there, even though he'd practically memorized every word. You ready for this, son? Mr. Ashford asked, appearing beside him with that calm smile that David had learned meant he was actually more nervous than he was letting on. Over the past 3 months, David had discovered that despite all his money and success, Robert Ashford still got anxious about things that mattered to him. I think so, David replied, though his voice came out higher than normal. It's just weird, you know? 3 months ago, nobody knew who I was. Now I'm supposed to get up there and talk to all these people like I'm some kind of expert on life. Mr. Ashford adjusted David's tie, a gesture that reminded David of how his mom used to fix his collar before school pictures. "You're not an expert on life," he said. "You're an expert on being David Rodriguez, and that's exactly what these kids need to hear about." Through the small gap in the stage curtains, David could see the auditorium filling up with students, teachers, parents, and community members. The local newspaper had written an article about the Ashford Foundation Youth Leadership Program, and word had spread quickly through the community. People were curious about the grocery store worker who had saved a millionaire's wife and ended up with a full college scholarship. But it wasn't just curiosity that had filled the auditorium. Sitting in the front row was Victoria Ashford, looking healthy and elegant in a blue dress that matched her eyes. She had insisted on being here for David's first public speech, calling him her guardian angel to anyone who would listen. Next to her sat David's mom, Linda, wearing her best dress and trying not to cry with pride. "Ladies and gentlemen," Principal Martinez's voice came over the sound system, "please welcome David Rodriguez and the announcement of the Ashford Foundation Youth Leadership Program." The curtains opened, and David felt momentarily blinded by the stage lights. He walked to the podium on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else, and looked out at a sea of faces that seemed to stretch on forever. For a moment, his mind went completely blank, and he forgot every single word of his carefully prepared speech. Then he saw his mom in the front row, giving him a thumbs up and mouthing, "You've got this." He saw Carlos from his chemistry class, sitting with a group of students and looking amazed that his quiet friend was up on stage. He saw Mr. Peterson from the grocery store, who had given him time off for this event and was beaming like a proud grandfather. "Hi, everyone," David began, his voice echoing through the auditorium. 3 months ago, if someone had told me I'd be standing up here talking to all of you, I would have thought they were crazy." A few people in the audience chuckled, and David felt some of his nervousness start to fade. "I'm not here because I'm special or because I did something amazing. I'm here because I was walking home from work one night and I saw someone who needed help. That's it. Nothing fancy, nothing heroic. I just couldn't walk past someone who was in trouble." He paused and looked at Victoria Ashford, who was dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. "What I learned that night is that sometimes the smallest decisions can change everything. I had a choice. Keep walking and pretend I didn't see anything, or stop and try to help. I chose to help, and that choice didn't just save someone's life. It changed my life too." David pulled his notes from his pocket, but he realized he didn't need them anymore. The words were coming naturally now. "Mr. and Mrs. Ashford didn't just offer me a scholarship. They offered me something bigger, a chance to be part of something that could help other kids who are like me. Kids who work after school to help their families. Kids who have dreams, but don't think those dreams are possible because of money." He gestured toward a table at the side of the stage where several folders were stacked neatly. "Today, we're announcing that 12 other students from our community have been selected for the Ashford Foundation program. 12 kids who will get the same opportunity I got, full college scholarships, mentorship, and the chance to help find the next group of students who deserve this opportunity." The auditorium erupted in applause, and David had to wait for it to quiet down before he could continue. "But here's the thing that's really important," he said, his voice getting stronger. "You don't have to wait for someone to save you. You don't have to wait for a program or a scholarship or someone with money to notice you. Every single day you have chances to help other people, to make choices that matter, to be the kind of person who runs toward trouble instead of away from it." He thought about that night 3 months ago, walking home tired from work, wanting nothing more than to get to his small bedroom and fall asleep. "I was tired that night. I was in a neighborhood where I didn't belong, walking past houses I could never afford. I could have easily convinced myself that whatever was happening wasn't my problem, but I learned something that night that I want all of you to remember. When you see someone in trouble, you have a choice. You can walk away or you can stop and help. And sometimes that choice changes everything." David looked out at the audience and saw kids his own age, sitting forward in their seats listening intently. He saw teachers nodding along with his words. He saw parents looking at their own children with new appreciation. The Ashford Foundation isn't just about giving scholarships to kids with good grades. It's about finding young people who have character, who care about others, who want to make the world a little bit better. If that sounds like you, then I want you to know that opportunities are coming. But more importantly, I want you to know that you don't have to wait for opportunities to start making a difference. As David finished his speech and stepped away from the podium, the entire auditorium rose to their feet in applause. He felt overwhelmed by the response, but also incredibly grateful. Grateful for the chance encounter that had changed his life. Grateful for the Ashfords who had seen potential in a scared teenager, and grateful for the opportunity to help other kids believe that their dreams were possible. Later, as people began to leave the auditorium, Victoria Ashford approached David with tears in her eyes. "You know," she said, "that night when you found me, I was coming home from a charity board meeting where we had been talking about how to help young people in our community. I had been feeling frustrated because everything we discussed seemed so complicated and bureaucratic." She smiled and took his hand. "I never imagined that the solution would find me lying on a sidewalk, and that it would come in the form of a 16-year-old boy who just did what felt right." David squeezed her hand gently. "Mrs. Ashford, I think maybe we helped each other that night." As he looked around the auditorium at families talking excitedly about the new program, at students asking questions about how to apply, and at his own mother who was crying happy tears while talking to Mr. Ashford, David realized that sometimes the most extraordinary things come from the most ordinary moments. All it takes is the willingness to stop when someone needs help, and the courage to believe that one person really can make a difference.